As the judge read the sentence, a rancher rose and offered to marry her instead. The gavel was already in his hand. Judge Harlan Cobb had it lifted, the way he always did when he'd made up his mind before anyone finished talking, that gavel up like he was about to drive a nail, like whatever came out of his mouth next was a thing already done. I'd sat in that courtroom maybe a dozen times over 20 years. Disputes about fence lines. A water claim I'd filed after the dry summer of '81. Once for a horse that went missing and turned up in Pete Garnett's pasture with a changed brand, though nothing ever came of that. I knew the room the way you know any room you've been in often enough to stop seeing it. The warped floorboards near the window, the water stain on the plaster above the jury box that was shaped like the boot heel of a left foot, the way sound bounced flat off the low ceiling so that even a whisper carried if you were paying attention. I was sitting in the third row, end of the bench, close to the aisle, which was where I always sat because I have a bad hip and I don't like being wedged in. January cold coming off the walls. I had my coat on. I hadn't come for this. I'd come because Denny Stout owed me $60, and Denny was supposed to appear that morning on a debt matter, and I figured if I was going to see a cent of what he owed me, I'd better be in the room when his name was called. Denny never showed. His case got pushed to the following Tuesday. I should have left then. I had the fence post on the north pasture that needed resetting before the ground froze any harder. I had 2 horses that needed reshoeing. I had a month of ledger work backed up on my desk. I had my hat in my hand, and I was already thinking about the ride back and whether I'd eat in town before heading out or wait until I got home. Then they brought her in. Her name was Claire Aldrin. I didn't know that yet. I knew her face, the way you know faces in a town of 400. I'd seen her at Mercer's Dry Goods, maybe twice at the livery, once coming out of the post office with a letter she was reading while she walked and didn't look up when she nearly walked into me. I'd stepped aside and she'd looked up quick and said sorry and gone back to reading without breaking stride. Brown hair, not remarkable, medium height. She wore the same dark wool coat both times I'd seen her at the Dry Goods. It had gone thin at the elbows, the kind of worn down you see on coats that are doing more work than they were made for. She was the widow of Thomas Aldrin, who'd been a carpenter out on Cutter Road and had died of a lung thing the previous winter. I knew that much because Doc Pruitt had mentioned it when I was in for my hip, the way Doc mentioned things as information, not as grief. Thomas Aldrin's gone. Wife's left with the 2 boys and the house note. She came in with her hands clasped in front of her, and she sat down in the defendant's chair, and she looked straight ahead at nothing. The charge was read. I put my hat back on my knee and I listened. The charge was fraud. The specific thing was this. Following her husband's death, she had filed a homestead continuation claim on a 40-acre parcel attached to their property on the west side of Cutter Road, asserting she intended to maintain and work the land as required by the original filing. The claim had been granted. Then, according to the county assessor's office, she had failed to make a single improvement to the property in the subsequent 8 months, had not broken ground, had not built fence, had not planted. Furthermore, and this was where the charge became something more than a civil matter, it was alleged she had leased a portion of that 40 acres to a man named Gideon Hurl for grazing rights, collecting payment 3 times across those 8 months, which constituted using a fraudulently maintained homestead claim for personal financial gain. The prosecutor was a man named Olds who had a habit of tucking his thumbs into his vest when he spoke, like he was holding himself in. He was competent enough, Olds. He knew what the law said and he said it plainly, and if you listened to him without thinking about much else, what he was saying made a kind of sense. He said, "The law is plain. The purpose of the homestead provision is settlement and cultivation, not passive income. Mrs. Aldrin made representations to the county that she intended to work this land. She did not work it. She collected $22 from Mr. Hurl across 3 payments and made no improvements whatsoever. The county's position is that the claim should be voided, the $22 repaid with penalty, and given the deliberate nature of the misrepresentation, that Mrs. Aldrin be remanded to the territorial facility at Glendale for a period of no less than 60 days. 60 days. I had been to the territorial facility at Glendale once, years ago. They'd had a man there I needed to speak with about a grazing dispute that had gone sideways, a man who would rather have settled the thing out of court and hadn't gotten the chance. The facility was a 2-story stone building with windows you could cover with one hand. The cells ran narrow, 4 feet across, and the beds were boards with a single blanket folded at the foot. The corridor smelled of damp stone and lye. I'd been there in June and found it bleak enough. What it would be in January, the wind off the northern plains driving straight at those small windows, the water in the basin freezing overnight, I could well imagine. Claire Aldrin had 2 boys. I didn't know their ages. I didn't know their names. I was looking at the back of her head, the way her hair was pinned up, some of it coming loose on the left side, and I was thinking about the 40 acres on Cutter Road, which I happened to know because it abutted the southwest corner of a piece of land I'd looked at buying in 1879 before I'd decided against it. I'd walked that 40 twice and had Emmett Drake run an assessment on it. The upper section was hardpan caliche, grayish, stubborn ground, the kind that cracks tools if you push too hard, and you couldn't grain farm it with a team of mules in a season, much less with no team and no season to spare. The lower section sat in a swale that flooded every March and April when the creek came up. You couldn't put anything on it until May at the earliest, and then the ground was soft enough to bog a horse past the fetlock. You could graze it if you weren't expecting much. I decided against buying it because what I would have had to put into it wasn't worth what I'd get out. Thomas Aldrin had been a carpenter. He hadn't been a farmer and he hadn't been a rancher, and the 40 acres had been part of his property, the way a difficult room is part of a house, there by inheritance, not by plan. The idea that his widow, a woman alone with 2 children and no draft animals and no money to hire help, was going to break ground and plant and improve 40 acres of hardpan and swale by herself, was the kind of idea that sounds reasonable on paper and is nothing but cruel in practice. $22. She'd leased the grazing rights for $22 across 3 payments so she could feed her children, and now the county wanted 60 days in a stone building in January, and the land stripped away from her as well. The judge had his gavel up. He said, "Mrs. Aldrin, you have heard the county's recommendation. Do you wish to speak before I impose sentence?" She stood up. Her voice was steady. I'll give her that. It was steadier than I expected, steadier maybe than it had any right to be. She said, "Your Honor, I know what the law says. I'm not arguing the law. I leased that pasture because my boys needed to eat and I had no other way to make it happen. If I had it to do again, I would do it again." A pause, and in that pause she seemed to let go of something and take hold of something else. "I am not sorry for keeping my children fed. I am sorry I didn't understand the law well enough to know I was breaking it." The room was quiet. Harlan Cobb nodded once slowly, the way he did when he decided something and was just running out the clock before saying it. He picked up the gavel. I stood up. I don't know exactly what I was doing when I stood up. I'm not a man who acts without thinking. I've been careful most of my life, deliberate, slow to commit. I've watched other men move fast on impulse, and I've watched what it cost them. My father was a fast mover and an impulse man, and he died broke in a lean-to outside of Abilene, and I'd spent most of my life since 17 being the opposite of him in every particular. Eleanor used to say I thought too long about everything, that I'd think a thing through until the moment for it had already passed. She was probably right. She was right about most things. Eleanor died in the fall of 1878, fever, gone in 4 days, and I had spent 11 years since then being deliberate and careful on a ranch that was paid off and running well and entirely empty of anything but work and solitude, and the occasional visit from my nephew out of Tucson. I stood up and I said, "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court." Cobb looked at me over his spectacles. He said, "Mr. Briggs, this isn't your matter." I said, "I understand that, sir. I'm asking for 2 minutes." He set the gavel down. That was something. When Harlan Cobb set the gavel down, it meant he was still listening. He gestured with 2 fingers, "Go ahead." I said, "I know that 40 acres. I looked at it seriously in '79, walked it twice, had Emmett Drake assess it. He'll tell you what I'm telling you now, which is that the upper section is hardpan caliche that a team of mules couldn't break in a season, and the lower section floods to the knee in March and April. A widow woman with 2 children and no draft animals, and no money for a hired hand, was not going to improve that land. The county knew this, or should have known it when they approved the filing. What they actually approved was a woman keeping a piece of land her husband worked for so she'd have something to stand on." Old said, "Your Honor, the witness is characterizing." Cobb held up 1 finger. Old stopped. I kept going. "She leased the grazing rights because it was the only use the land would support and because she needed the money. I'm not standing here telling you the law doesn't say what it says. I'm telling you what the law produces in this particular case, which is that a woman who broke no one's fence and stole no one's cattle and hurt no one in this county is going to spend 60 days in Glendale in January while her children are where, exactly?" I looked at Olds. "Where do her boys go for 60 days?" Old said, "That is not a legal consideration. It's the only consideration that matters to anyone with a conscience," I said, and I heard the edge in my voice and I didn't pull it back. I'd been keeping that edge in check for most of my adult life, and I didn't see a reason to keep at it just now. "Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider an alternative resolution." Cobb said, "And what resolution would that be, Mr. Briggs?" And here is where it gets harder to explain, because I hadn't planned what came next, hadn't thought it through the way I usually thought things through. And yet when I said it flat and level, like I'd been holding it in my mouth all morning waiting for the right moment to set it down. I said, "I'll marry her if she'll have me. The homestead claim becomes a marital asset maintained under my operation. The $22 she owes the county I'll pay today in full before we leave this building. The land gets improved, I've got the equipment and the hands to do it, and I'll start in the spring when the ground allows. The county gets exactly what the law is supposed to produce, which is settled and worked land, and this woman does not go to Glendale." The room didn't make a sound. I was looking at Cobb. I could feel people looking at me. I didn't look at her. Cobb said, "Mr. Briggs, marriage is not typically a legal remedy in this court." "No, sir," I said. "It's a personal one, but it resolves every element of the county's complaint, the maintenance of the claim, the repayment of the penalty, and the cultivation of the land. You'd be imposing a sentence on a widow with 2 children for $22. I'm offering to make it right." Cobb looked at me a long time. He put his pen down. He looked at Olds. Olds said, carefully, "The county has no objection in principle to a resolution that satisfies the obligations in question, provided the court is satisfied with the terms." Cobb said, "Mrs. Aldrin." She had been sitting very still. Now she turned and looked at me for the first time straight on. I got my first clear look at her face. She was maybe 35, older than I'd thought from behind, with eyes that were dark and tired and not what I'd call soft by any measure. She was looking at me the way you look at something you can't quite make the shape of. Cobb said, "A man has made you an offer in this courtroom. I want to be plain with you. I have no power to compel it, and I wouldn't if I could. Whatever you decide here is freely your decision and no one else's. Do you understand?" She said, "Yes, Your Honor." Cobb said, "Then what do you say?" She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, "I'd need to speak with him first." Cobb almost smiled. He said, "That seems reasonable." He looked at the clock on the wall. "15 minutes, bailiff, give them the side room." The side room was where witnesses waited. 2 chairs, a table, a window that looked onto the alley between the courthouse and the barber shop, cold coming off the glass. There was a crack in the plaster above the window that ran to the ceiling in an irregular line, and the floor had a slight lean toward the south wall. She went in first and I followed, and the bailiff closed the door behind us. The sound of the courtroom cut off. She stood with her back to the window and her arms crossed, not like she was cold, like she was holding herself together enough to think clearly. She said, "I don't know you." I said, "My name is Cal Briggs. I run the Briggs place out on the Harmon Road, 3 miles east of the creek crossing. About 1,100 acres, good grass, cattle operation, some horses. The house is solid. It was built in 1872 and I've kept it up." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "You're right, it's not." I sat down in one of the chairs, partly because my hip was starting to ache and partly because I figured one of us sitting down made the room feel less like a standoff. I said, "What I can tell you is this. I'm 54 years old. I've been alone since 1878. My ranch runs clean and it's paid off. I'm not a drunk and I'm not a violent man. I have never raised my hand to a woman in my life and I never would." I paused. "I don't have any pretty way to explain what I just did in that courtroom. I don't entirely understand it myself. What I can tell you is I meant it." She said, "Why?" "Because what they were about to do to you was wrong," I said, "and I was in a position to stop it." She stood there looking at me. Whatever she was seeing, she wasn't done looking at it yet. She said, "My boys are 7 and 9. They're at the Hargreaves place right now. Marta Hargreaves took them in for the day. I don't know what would have happened to them for 60 days. Her voice didn't break. She was just telling me a fact, and the fact was bad enough without any decoration. I've been trying not to think about it since the moment they charged me, trying to just deal with the next thing. Thomas has been gone 10 months. The house note is behind. I've been taking in sewing, and there isn't enough of it. The $22 from Gideon Hurl was the only solid money I've seen since the funeral." I said, "I know." She said, "You don't actually, but I believe you think you do, and I believe you're trying to be honest with me, so I'll take it in the spirit it was meant." She looked at her hands. "If I say yes to this, what does it look like? What do you actually want from me?" It was a straight question, and it deserved a straight answer. I didn't dress it up. I said, "I want someone in the house. I want the ranch to feel like something other than a place I'm waiting to die in. I'd like someone to eat supper with." I stopped. "I'm not going to make you a list of demands. You're a grown woman who's been running a household alone for 10 months. I expect you know how to work, and I expect you do your share. I'd ask the same of myself. The boys would have a room and a school to go to and enough to eat. I'd treat them decently. I can't promise to be their father because that's not something you can promise a person, but I'd be fair with them and straight with them, and I wouldn't be a source of grief in their lives." She looked at me for a long time. The room was cold, and the light through the window was thin, and the crack in the plaster ran up toward the ceiling, and neither of us was saying anything. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people being careful not to miss each other. She said, "You stood up in there before you knew any of this, before you knew about the boys or the house note or any of it." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" And I said the true thing. "Because you said you weren't sorry for keeping your children fed. And the way you said it, I don't know, it sat right with me." Something shifted in her face. Not soft, I wouldn't call it soft. More like something that had been braced hard against a wall took the smallest step back from it. A person recognizing something. She said, "All right, Mr. Briggs, I'll say yes." Cobb married us himself that afternoon in the courthouse, with the bailiff and a court clerk named Fenn as witnesses. It took about 4 minutes. She said her part clearly, and I said mine, and Cobb signed the paper and handed me my copy and said, in a tone that was not unkind, "I hope you know what you've done, Mr. Briggs." I said, "I expect I'm about to find out, Your Honor." Something close to approval crossed his face and was gone. I paid the $22 penalty and the county clerk's fee at the window on the way out. I had $60 in my coat pocket. I'd brought it for Denny's stout, and I used 31 of it and put the rest away. She went to collect her boys from the Hargreaves' place on Candle Street, and I walked over separately, wanting to give her a moment to explain things to them before they had to look at the man who'd explained things to a courtroom. The Hargreaves' house was white with a blue door, and Marta Hargreaves opened it before I knocked. She looked at me with an expression that held both approval and the skepticism of a woman who had seen men make grand gestures and knew the difference between a gesture that held and one that didn't. She said, "She told me. Come in." The boys were named Henry and James. Henry was the 9-year-old, tall for his age, dark-haired like his mother, with the kind of serious face that made you think he'd been asked to be older than he was for too long. He had a small piece of wood in his hand that he'd been whittling at, running his thumb along the grain of it, and he looked at me with the measuring look of a boy who had already learned there was a cost to trusting wrong. James was 7 and had a gap in his front teeth and was attempting to balance a wooden spoon on his nose. He dropped it when he saw me, looked at his mother, looked at me, and said, "Are you the man?" I said, "I'm the man." He said, "Marta made us lunch. Did you eat?" I said, "Not yet." He seemed to find this satisfactory. He picked up the spoon and went back to his project. Henry didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We've got furniture at the house on Cutter Road. I don't want to leave it." I said, "We'll bring it. Whatever fits we'll bring, and what doesn't fit we'll sell for a fair price, and you'll know what we got for it." He thought about that. He said, "All right." We moved them out to the ranch 4 days later. I'd spent those 4 days going through the house with a purpose I hadn't had in a long time, cleaning the back room that had been used for storage, getting the accumulated junk of 11 bachelor years out of it and the walls freshly whitewashed, putting up a second bed I bought from Ira Hennessy's furniture place on Commerce Street, getting the woodbox filled and the kitchen stocked past what a single man needed. I'd gone through the root cellar and took stock of what I had and what I was short and filled what I was short. I washed the windows, which I'd been meaning to do for 2 years. I am not naturally a domestic person. I know how to keep myself alive, and I know how to run cattle, and I know how to manage men and the equipment and the land. Making a house into a place where a woman and 2 children could settle, that was different work, and I moved through it slowly, checking things twice, the way you check a fence line you've just mended before you trust it. The morning they arrived, I was in the barn, resetting a loose hinge on the near stall door when I heard the wagon. I came out and she was on the seat with James on her lap and Henry beside her, and everything they owned stacked in the bed, furniture, trunks, the boys' things, her sewing equipment wrapped in oilcloth against the January weather, a crate of kitchen goods, a lamp with a blue glass shade. She'd hired Ned Packer to drive it out. She was wearing the dark wool coat and there was color in her face from the cold, and she looked at the house, and then at me and then at the house again, taking its measure, deciding whether it was what I'd told her it was. I said, "The back room's set up for the boys. If the furniture arrangement's wrong you can move it." She said, "I'm sure it's fine." James said, "Is that a horse barn? Can I see?" I said, "After we unload." He thought about this and decided it was acceptable. Henry climbed down from the wagon without being asked, went directly to the back and started pulling at one end of a trunk. I went around and took the other end. He didn't say anything. We carried the trunk to the porch, set it down, and went back for the next thing, and then the next, and that was how it started. 2 people lifting what was heavy without having to discuss it. He was 9 years old, and he had already learned the particular language of men who know that work is what you do when you don't know what else to do. And I had been speaking that language for 54 years, and we understood each other in it from the first afternoon. The first weeks were awkward in the way I expected them to be. Two strangers learning the geography of a house together, which side of the kitchen each person tended toward, which silences were comfortable and which needed something said into them. She was careful with me. Polite, precise, not cold but not easy. She cooked well, better than I did by a wide margin, and she reorganized the kitchen in the first week in ways I hadn't thought to do in 11 years. Pots where they made sense to reach, dry goods labeled in her handwriting. The bread box moved to where the morning light hit it instead of where I'd shoved it against the far wall. Small adjustments that made the whole room run more sensibly. She took over the mending without being asked and started taking in sewing from town, which I hadn't asked her to do but didn't argue with because I understood she needed the independence of it. She'd kept herself and her boys for 10 months by her own hand. She wasn't going to stop being that person because she'd moved into someone else's house. I respected it. I'd have thought less of her if she had. The boys were in school by the second week. Henry walked there and back and did his homework at the kitchen table with his head down, quiet and methodical. He was in the habit of not asking for help with what he could do himself, which I recognized as something he'd picked up from living in a house where asking for help had been its own kind of grief. When the person you'd ask isn't there anymore, you learn to manage without. James was louder and less contained and took an immediate and persistent interest in every animal on the property. The horses, the cattle, the barn cats who tolerated him without enthusiasm. And then there was Edmund. Edmund was a rooster. He'd come with the property when I bought it from old era Clifton back in '76 and had outlasted every other chicken on the place by what appeared to be sheer force of personality and a commitment to hostility that I'd never seen equaled in an animal that small. He was going on 9 or 10 years old and he hated everyone. James discovered Edmund on the second morning and spent the better part of a week attempting to befriend him. Edmund declined the friendship by chasing James across the yard with a seriousness of purpose that was almost admirable. James found this funny rather than discouraging. He named the rooster Edmund and began tracking their encounters the way a military man tracks campaign engagements. Who held the field, who retreated, what the conditions were. I taught Henry to ride on a Saturday morning in February, in the near pasture on cord. A bay gelding I'd had for 7 years, reliable and forgiving, the kind of horse that made up for a rider's mistakes without making a scene about it. Henry sat the saddle too stiff at first, the way children do, trying to control with his hands what you have to control with your whole weight. I walked alongside and didn't say much. By the end of an hour he'd softened into the saddle and was reading where Cord wanted to go before Cord went there. That was the sign. When a rider starts reading the horse starts working with them. When we were putting Cord away, Henry said, "My father wanted to teach me. He never got to." I said, "I know." He said, "This doesn't mean I'm forgetting him." I said, "I wouldn't expect you to. He's worth remembering." Henry looked at me. He said, "You didn't know him." I said, "No, but you do. That's enough." He nodded once and went inside. I stood in the barn for a minute, just with Cord, not doing anything particular, thinking about what it meant that a 9-year-old boy had been carrying his father's memory like a weight he was afraid someone would try to take from him. I thought about how I'd carried Alieners for 11 years, not like a weight by then, but like a thing that was part of the shape of me, present without being heavy. How I wouldn't have given it up for anything. I understood that boy in that moment, better than I might have understood him if I'd been younger. Claire and I were polite to each other for about 6 weeks. That is the only word for it, polite. She asked about the ranch and I told her what I could because I thought she should know how the operation ran, what a good year looked like and what a dry year cost, who the men were and what they were good at. She listened carefully and asked smart questions that showed she'd been thinking about what I'd said before she asked the next thing. She wasn't trying to run my ranch. She was just trying to understand the ground she was standing on, which seemed like nothing more than good sense to me. In the evenings she sewed and I worked the ledger or read or worked on whatever equipment needed work, and we were in the same room without speaking, and that was mostly fine, and occasionally not fine, and then one of us would say something and it would become fine again. We were finding the edges of each other, feeling out what we were to each other in this arrangement that neither of us had planned. She said to me once in the kitchen, on a Tuesday evening when James was in bed and Henry was reading at the table with the lamp pulled close, "I want to be useful here. I don't want to be a thing you're maintaining." I said, "You're not." She said, "I want to make sure we're clear on that. I pulled my weight before and I'll pull it now. I'm not asking for charity." I said, "I never thought you were. You said as much in court." She looked at me, she said, "You heard that?" I said, "I heard everything you said. That's partly what made me stand up." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I meant it, you know, about not being sorry." I said, "I know. That's why it sat right with me." The first real conversation we'd had since the side room at the courthouse. She went back to her sewing and I went back to the ledger, and the room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of two people keeping careful distance, but the quiet of two people who had set something true down on the table between them and could sit near it without discomfort. The town had an opinion about what I'd done. I knew it would. 400 people, a courtroom that had been full, a bailiff who talked and a clerk who talked, and Marta Hargreaves, who had been in the third row 2 benches behind me, and who was the most efficient disseminator of information in the county. By the evening of the day I'd stood up, everyone in Canfield knew that Cal Briggs had married a stranger in the courthouse to keep her out of Glendale. By the end of the week I'd heard 3 versions of it, each slightly different, each with a different emphasis. Some people thought I'd done a fine thing. Frank Abel at the dry goods shook my hand when I came in for supplies the following week and said, "Good man, Cal," and wouldn't take any more from me. Doc Pruitt, who I ran into outside the post office, said, "I heard what you did." I've always thought Harlan Cobb ran that court too close to the letter. The minister, who I saw once from a distance and with whom I had no particular relationship, made a point of walking across the street to tell me what I'd done reflected well on the community. I thanked him and walked on. Some people thought I'd done a strange thing and said so in a way that was half admiring and half uncertain. A rancher named Pete Du Bois, who ran cattle on the Eastern Range and who I'd known for 15 years, caught me at the feed store and said, "I'd have done the same thing probably, but I'm not sure I'd have thought of it." I told him I hadn't thought of it much either. And some people, fewer but they existed, thought I'd done a foolish thing, taking on a woman I didn't know and her children on a moment's impulse in a courtroom. These people didn't say it to my face, but I knew who they were. You always know. There were 2 men in particular who had always viewed the Briggs operation with the particular interest of men who would have been glad to see it fail, and I could feel their attention like a thing with weight. They were waiting to see what the situation produced. I let them wait. I had been letting men like that wait my whole life, and they'd never gotten what they were waiting for. Claire was aware of the town's interest. She didn't say much about it directly, but she said to me one evening after coming back from town, "Marta Hargreaves told me that Ed Fells told his wife you'd lost your mind." I said, "Ed Fells has been of that opinion since I outbid him on the Clifton property in '76. His wife's a decent woman and I'm sorry for her." She looked at me for a moment and then said, "You're not bothered by it?" I said, "Not particularly." She said, "I am a little. Not because I think they're right, because I know what people say about a woman who benefits from a situation, even when she didn't design it." I said, "What do you want to do about it?" She said, "Nothing. You can't do anything about it. You just have to live in a way that makes it irrelevant eventually." She paused. Thomas would have wanted to argue with them. He'd have wanted to go find Ed Fells and make the case. I always had to talk him out of it. I said, "I don't argue with men who have already decided." She said, "No, you just do the thing and let the thing speak." She looked at me directly. "That's what you did in the courtroom." I didn't say anything to that. She said, "I'm not going to embarrass you here, Cal, whatever else happens." I said, "I know that." She said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Same reason I stood up. Something about the way you carry yourself tells you what a person's made of." She was quiet after that. In the particular way she went quiet when something had landed somewhere real in her, and she went back to her sewing, and I went back to my ledger, and the evening went on. February was cold. Not brutally so, we'd had worse, but steady, the kind of cold that works its way into the ground and the walls and sits there. The cattle needed checking twice a day, and the water in the far trough froze 2 nights in a row, and I was up before 4 both mornings to break it. Lewis and Garrett took the far-range checks without being asked, which was the kind of thing they did without ceremony, the particular grace of men who had worked long enough with a person to know what was needed before it was said. I started taking Henry on the early morning checks. Not for work, he was 9, and the work was cold and hard, and I wouldn't have put that on a child, but because he'd asked, and because I thought he should know what the operation looked like from the inside, all the hours of it, not just the parts that happened at a reasonable time of day. He got up without complaint in the dark, and he dressed quickly, and he was always by the barn door when I came through with the lantern, already in his coat and his hat, waiting without fidgeting. He didn't talk much on those morning checks. Neither did I. We moved through the work, checking the herd, breaking ice, filling the hay racks, looking for animals that were off or weak or showing signs of trouble, and the dark lifted slowly and the cold was around us, and we did what needed doing. I found myself looking forward to those mornings in a way that surprised me, not because of any particular thing that happened in them. Just the company of a boy who was learning something real, and knew it was real and took it seriously. One morning in late February, we found a heifer down in the far south corner of the pasture. She'd gone down in the night, one of the 2-year-olds, first calf coming, and she'd gotten into trouble and was lying on her side with her legs working and her breathing wrong. I sent Henry back to the barn for the rope and the lamp, and I knelt down in the frozen grass and got to work, and an hour later we had the calf on the ground, alive, and the heifer breathing right, and Henry was on his knees in the mud and frost beside her, his hands on the side of her neck, and she was letting him keep them there. He said, "Is she going to be all right?" I said, "She's going to be fine." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You knew what to do." I said, "I've done it before." He said, "How many times?" I said, "More than I could count." He looked at the heifer. He said, "I want to know how to do that." I said, "You'll learn, takes time." He nodded. He stayed there with his hands on the heifer's neck until she was calm and the calf was up and finding its feet, and then we walked back across the pasture in the early morning light, and he didn't say anything, but I could feel him thinking beside me, working through what he'd seen, turning it over. That was the thing about Henry. He never let an experience pass through him without examining it. When we got to the barn, he said, "My mother said you were a good man. Before she told me what was going to happen in January, she said, 'This man seems like a good man.'" I said, "She told you that?" He said, "In the side room, before she came back out. She said it to herself, but I heard it." He looked at me. "I thought you should know." I said, "Thank you for telling me." He went in to get warm, and I stood at the barn door for a moment in the thin morning light, with the cold on my face and the cattle moving behind me, and the house with its windows lit from the kitchen where she was already up making coffee. And I thought, there are things a man does without knowing what they'll produce. And then one morning a 9-year-old boy tells him what his mother said in a cold courthouse room, and the whole of it comes clear. March came and the ground began to soften, and I started working the 40 acres on Cutter Road. I told the court I would, and I told myself I would, and I kept to it. I put Lewis and Garrett on it. Lewis had been with me 6 years, and knew the land the way only someone who'd worked it through all its moods could know it. And Garrett was younger and stronger, and had the particular energy of a man who liked hard physical work for its own sake. which was exactly what the upper section was going to require. I worked alongside them because I told the court the land would be worked, and I didn't read that as something I could assign entirely to other men and call done. The upper section was exactly what I'd told the court. Hardpan caliche, gray and stubborn, the kind of ground that vibrated back through a pickaxe handle into your shoulders when you hit it wrong. We didn't try to break it for grain. That would have been a season's work for nothing. We cleared the scrub over 3 days, which meant cutting and hauling and burning, cold work in the March wind that found every gap in a coat. Then we rocked up the drainage berm on the low end, building it out of the stones we'd been pulling from the upper section, which was the one thing the upper section produced in abundance, and put in a grass seeding on the cleared ground, a mix that would take hold in rocky soil and hold it. The low section was the harder work. 4 days of trenching in mud that was soft from snowmelt and cold enough to numb your hands to the wrist inside an hour. We trenched 4 runs off the main swale, building the grade so the spring runoff would channel clean toward the creek rather than spreading and standing. By the end of it, we were wet through to the skin by noon every day and warming up only when we were inside at night. And Garrett said something about the 40 acres that I won't repeat here, but that summarized the situation fairly. But when the trenching was done and we stood at the fence line and looked at what we'd built, you could see it, the grade running right, the berm holding, the soil already beginning to breathe differently now that it had a place to drain to. She came out to look at it one afternoon when we were about halfway done. She stood at the fence line in her coat with her arms crossed and looked at what we were doing. She had Henry with her. It was a Saturday and he'd asked to come along. He stood beside her and looked at the work with the same serious attention she had. She said, "You didn't have to do this yourself. You could have hired it out." I said, "I told the court I'd work it. That means I work it." She said, "You told the court to get me out of a sentence. You don't have to hold to everything you said in that room." I said opposed I'd been tamping and looked at her. I said, "I hold to what I say." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Yes, I'm beginning to understand that about you." She stood there for a while watching and then she said, "Thomas was a good man. He wasn't built for this country. The lung thing took him fast, but I think this country was taking him slow before that. It was too hard for him. He was a man who belonged in a city or a town, where work has walls around it." I didn't say anything. I let her say it. She said he loved the boys. He was a good father. I want to be clear about that. I said, "You don't have to clear anything with me." She said, "I know, I'm clearing it with myself." A pause. He used to say I was the hardest-headed woman he'd ever met. He meant it as a compliment, I think, most of the time. I said, "I believe it." She almost smiled at that. Just the corner, quick, then gone, but I saw it. The first time. A man who pays attention remembers the first time he sees something. Henry had crouched down to examine one of the drainage channels, running his finger along the cut edge the way he'd run his thumb along the wood he was whittling, learning the shape of a thing by feel. He said, "Will the water actually go here?" I said, "In March it will. Come back after the first hard rain and see." He looked up at me and nodded once, the serious nod of a boy who has made a note of something. By April the ranch was running with a different energy. I noticed it gradually, and then one morning it just seemed plain and obvious, the way a thing you've been slowly walking toward suddenly arrives all at once. The house had food cooking in it at the right times. There was wood in the kitchen box before I needed to fill it, which meant someone else was keeping track of it. The boys were loud in the yard after school, James in ongoing negotiations with Edmund, Henry on the top fence rail watching and trying not to smile. My men ate supper with us on Fridays, which had started when Lewis made some comment about the food smelling better on Fridays and had simply continued. And Claire fed them the way you'd feed men who did honest work and deserved a decent meal for it, without ceremony and without fuss. I was sleeping better, that was the other thing. I'd been a poor sleeper for years, Alina's death, and then just the long habit of solitude, lying awake in a house that had no sounds in it, the way a room with no furniture in it sounds bigger than it is. Now there were sounds, not loud ones. The particular creak of the hallway boards when Claire checked on the boys in the night, 3 steps, a pause, 2 more steps. The sound of James talking in his sleep, which he did apparently every night and covered an enormous range of subjects. The smell of bread cooling on the windowsill when I came in from the early chores at 6. Small things. They were filling the empty parts of the house, the way water fills in around stones, quietly, without effort, because that was the nature of the space. One evening I was in the barn late, working on a harness that had cracked at the breast collar. The stitching had given way and the leather had split, and I was working it back with waxed thread, slow work by lamplight with a curved needle that you have to push through cured leather by feel, not force, or you break the needle. It was maybe 10 o'clock. The main house light was still on. After a while, I heard the side door and her steps across the yard. I'd learned them without meaning to. The slight hesitation before the last step that was a little higher than the others. She came into the barn and held her lantern up until she found me in the corner. She said, "I brought coffee." She sat down on the stack of saddle blankets across from me and set the lantern on the barrel between us and handed me a cup. She'd brought one for herself. She looked at the harness in my lap without asking about it, just sat and drank her coffee and let me work. After a while she said, "James told me Edmund bit him on the ear today." I said, "Edmund bites everyone." She said, "James told him he was going to turn him into soup." I said, "Edmund's heard that before, doesn't seem to worry him." She laughed. A full one, not the corner of a smile this time, but an actual laugh, brief and low, and it went through the barn and the horses shifted and went still, and I sat there with the harness across my knee and I thought, there it is. That's what this house needed. That exact sound. I didn't say it. I went back to the stitch I was working, but I thought it and I held on to it. She settled and looked at the harness in my lap. She said, "You do everything yourself." I said, "I try to." She said, "I've noticed." I said, "Is that a criticism?" She said, "No, it's an observation. I do the same thing." She paused. "Thomas used to tell me I'd run myself into the ground because I couldn't ask for help. I told him I'd rather run myself into the ground than stand around waiting for someone who might not come." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I know you do." She looked at me over her cup. The lantern light moved a little between us when the air moved. "That's something I noticed about you early. We're built the same way in that regard. It's either going to be the thing that holds this together or the thing that makes it difficult." I said, "Probably both, depending on the day." She said, "Yes, probably." She sat in the barn until her coffee was done, and then she picked up the lantern and stood and said good night and walked back across the yard to the house. I sat in the dark for a while after she went in, the barn going quiet around me, just the horses breathing and the distant sound of the creek running high from the snowmelt. And I was thinking clearly for the first time in a long time. Not about the ranch or the work or any of the 100 things that usually ran in the back of my head. Just thinking about the fact of her, that she was in my house, and her boys were in the back room, and there was coffee in my hand she'd carried out through the cold because she'd thought of it. And something in all of that was more than I'd had in 11 years, and I knew it precisely. I said nothing for another 2 weeks. I was waiting to be sure, and I was waiting because I thought she deserved a man who was sure before he said the words. It was a Sunday in late April after church. She had gone. I hadn't, as I never did. She'd asked me once and I'd said the church and I had a complicated relationship I wouldn't describe further and she'd let it go, which was one of the things I'd noticed about her. She didn't push at a shut door. She took the boys and came back with a pound cake someone in the congregation had pressed on her, and a look on her face that said she'd been cornered by Marta Hargreaves for the better part of a half hour, and had been polite about it with significant effort. She set the cake on the table and said, "Marta wants to know if we're happy." I said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her we were managing fine." I said, "Is that the truth of it?" She stopped. She turned and looked at me. She said, "I think it's more than that, but I didn't know what to tell Marta." I said, "What would you tell me?" She came and sat down across the table. She set her hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment, then looked at me. She said, "I've been trying to figure out what to do with you, Cal Briggs, since the day you stood up in that courtroom, because you did something I didn't expect and I haven't been able to stop thinking about what it means." I said, "What's that?" She said, "You didn't wait to know whether it made sense. You didn't calculate it. You just stood up and put yourself between me and a bad thing and you didn't ask anything back." She looked at her hands. "I've been married before. Thomas was good. But Thomas waited for things to make sense before he moved, and sometimes by the time they made sense the moment was gone." She looked up. "You didn't do that." I said, "No." She said, "I've been running on my own nerves since he died and I am tired. I'm not saying I want to stop being who I am. I'm not looking to put myself in someone else's hands, but I'm tired of it only ever being me." She paused. "The boys have settled in here, Cal. Henry told me last week he likes it here. He hasn't said he liked anything since his father died." Her voice caught once on that, then leveled. "He told me this morning that he wants to learn to work cattle." I said, "I know. He told me the same thing Wednesday." She said, "Did he?" I said, "We were moving the south herd and he rode out to watch. Afterward he asked if I'd show him how to work a gather." She was quiet for a moment. Something was moving in her face, something she was working through, and I waited. She said, "I was afraid of this, of it working. Because if it works it means I have to feel something, and I wasn't ready to feel something." I said, "Are you ready now?" She said, "I don't know, I think so." I said, "That's enough for me." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She just left it there, warm and certain, and we sat at the kitchen table with the pound cake between us and the Sunday light coming through the window at a low angle, and I could hear James outside and Edmund in the yard making his general feelings known, and none of it seemed distant or trivial. It all seemed exactly where it should be. I turned my hand over under hers and held it. She didn't pull back. The 40 acres came in good that summer. The grass on the upper section took in June, and by July was holding 22 head with room left over, 22 head where there'd been nothing but scrub and hardpan the winter before. The drainage trenches had done their work. The spring runoff had channeled clean, and the ground had dried faster than anyone had seen it dry, firm enough by late April to bring cattle onto without losing them in the mud. Lewis said he'd never seen the low section like that, and Lewis had been in this valley, going on a decade. I filed the maintenance report with the county in June. The clerk who took it was the same man who'd been at the penalty window in January. He looked at the paperwork and then at me. He said, "Looks like the land's being worked." I said, "That's the idea." He stamped it. That was the end of the county's involvement. Henry started riding with Lewis on the South Range in August. He sat a horse well by then. He'd been practicing every Saturday since February, and Cord had finished the job I'd started, teaching him the patience and quietness that cattle work requires. Lewis told me one evening at supper, in the matter-of-fact way Lewis said things worth saying, that the boy had a feel for it. Coming from Lewis, that meant something. James had reached an understanding with Edmund by September. I'm not entirely sure what the terms were, but they appeared to involve James feeding Edmund specific offerings, grain from his hand, crusts of bread, in exchange for Edmund tolerating his proximity without escalating to pursuit. Edmund remained suspicious of everyone else. The arrangement seemed to satisfy both parties. We married, really married, the way both of us meant it, on a Saturday in September in the yard of the ranch, with Lewis and Garrett and Marta Hargreaves and 8 or 10 others from town there to see it. The same judge, which was Cobb's own choice. He'd sent word through the bailiff that he'd be pleased to perform the ceremony, which was about as close to a gesture as Harlan Cobb made. He said at the start of it, "I find I prefer performing this ceremony under happier circumstances," and left it at that. Henry stood next to his mother in a new coat I'd bought him at Abel's Dry Goods. He'd picked the plainest one, dark wool, well-made, and he wore it the same way he wore most things, with the serious consideration of a boy who had been through enough to understand that things worth having were worth wearing right. James stood where he was supposed to stand for approximately the first 4 minutes, and then drifted 6 feet to investigate a beetle on the fence post, and then came back when the beetle's appeal was exhausted, inserting himself between Henry and his mother with the air of a boy who had timed his return correctly. She wore a dress the color of October sage, grayish-green, with small buttons at the collar. She'd made it herself on the machine in the spare room, the one from the old house on Cutter Road. I'd watched her working on it for 3 weeks in the evenings, and hadn't asked what it was because I could see it was something she was keeping to herself until it was done, and I had learned by then to let her have her private preparations. When the judge finished and said we were done, she looked at me. The same look as the side room in the courthouse, taking my measure, except now I could see that she already knew it and had known it for a while, and she was content with what she found. She put her hand against my jaw, not a performance, just her hand, warm and certain, her palm rough from the sewing work, against the side of my face, and she said, "You're a good man, Cal Briggs. I don't think you hear that enough." I didn't say anything. I just held still and let it sit on me, those words from this woman in this yard, and I thought about 11 years of solitude, and the work filling up the days and the nights that had nothing in them, and January in a cold courtroom and a gavel already in a judge's hand, and a woman saying she wasn't sorry for keeping her children fed, and I thought, a man sometimes acts without calculating and finds out afterward what he was doing. What I had been doing was this. All of it. James inserted himself between us with the energy of a boy who had reached the limit of his patience, and Marta Hargreaves was saying something behind us, and Lewis had a bottle open that he'd been keeping since morning, and Henry came and stood next to me without being asked. Just stood there at my elbow, shoulder height, looking out at the yard full of people with the quiet, steady presence he had. I put my hand on his shoulder. He let me. That night, after the guests had gone and the boys were in bed and the yard was quiet, she and I sat on the porch in the September dark with the last of Lewis's bottle between us. The valley was spread out ahead of us, just the shapes of the ridgeline and the black of the pasture, and the stars sitting low and clear the way they do in fall, before the cold sets in fully, when the air is sharp enough to make everything feel close. She said, "You know what I thought when you stood up in that courtroom?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "I thought, who is this man and what does he want? Because in my experience no one does something like that for nothing." I said, "Nothing's for nothing, but what I wanted was simple." She said, "What did you want?" I looked out at the valley. I thought about the 11 years alone, the work filling up the days, the habit of not wanting things because wanting things had a cost, the house that ran clean and produced everything it was supposed to produce and was empty in the ways that mattered, getting up every morning for the work and going to bed every night after it, and not much in between except more work and the occasional visit from my nephew, and the long quiet of a house that only ever heard one set of footsteps. I said, I wanted this, some version of this. I just didn't know it until I was already standing up. She was quiet for a long moment. The horses were still in the barn. Out in the pasture, one of the cattle moved in the dark, a single heavy footstep, then nothing. She leaned against me, just her shoulder against mine, settling in, the way you lean against something you've decided you can trust with your weight, and she said, "It's a good valley." I said, "It is." She said, "I think Thomas would have liked it, not the work wasn't for him, but the evenings, sitting outside like this and looking at all of it, he'd have liked the evenings." I said, "I think he'd have been glad you're here." She didn't answer that. She stayed leaned against me, and I felt her weight there, solid and warm and present. And I thought about the 40 acres out there in the dark running good grass, and Henry on a horse, and James and the rooster, and the sound of her laugh in the barn, and the coffee she'd carried across the cold yard because she'd thought of it. And I thought that sometimes a man stands up without planning to, and says a thing he didn't plan to say, and it turns out that was the whole of the thing. One right moment. The hinge the rest of your life turns on. Her hand found mine in the dark and held on. The stars moved the slow way they move. The horses were quiet. Something small moved through the dry grass beyond the fence line, a sound like a breath, then gone. The valley was ours, and the morning would bring work, and the work would be worth doing, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.